Good morning. Welcome to our brand new online platform where everybody's going to watch these lectures online, and we'll just proceed like we would normally in class, except with the exception of questions. As I've stated before in the previous video, that you guys are welcome to ask questions on the Q&A forum when they come to your mind. Anybody can answer those. It's not just me, so please feel free to do that. And then we'll just continue to go through lectures. So the first thing is announcements. You should have gotten this information in an email communication, but your first exposure dairy quiz is due March 23rd, that's Monday, at 8 a.m. Our homework for the dairy opens on Wednesday, March 25th, and is due March 27th by 11:59. Exam 2 is probably the biggest shift in scheduling that we've seen. So Exam 2 opens Friday, March 27th at 8:30 a.m. and closes Friday, March 27th at 10:30 a.m. So you have a 2-hour window to take that exam. If you have problems with that scheduled time, please let me know as soon as you can. I'm very flexible here. We're all having to be flexible, so please let me know as soon as you can, and we'll get you another time to take that exam. I realize that we are not all in our normal environment, and so our time constraints might be a little bit different. The last thing is the first exposure quiz for the wheat and macromolecular interactions, and that's opened Monday, March 16th, and is due March 30th by 8 a.m. So be sure to get that one in as well. All right, so we're moving on to dairy. We're talking about dairy this week and looking at what it takes to preserve milk by making yogurt and cheese. And in both instances, what we're doing is we're taking a liquid product and we're causing it to gel, right? So we've been over gelation and talked about how there's a bunch of polymeric compounds in a liquid, and some activation step happens that causes them to interact and form this three-dimensional network that can hold water and fat and other liquids in the food. So let's talk about what that activation step is, particularly with yogurt. So yogurt is a fermented food, as is cheese. And fermentation means that the bacteria that are present are going to be consuming a carbohydrate. In this case, in milk, the carbohydrate is lactose. So as these bacteria that are our culture that is actually fermenting the food, as the bacteria grow over time, they're consuming the lactose here. You can see the lactose concentration decreasing, the number of bacteria increasing. And as they ferment the food and consume that lactose, a byproduct of that fermentation is lactic acid. So as that lactose is consumed, lactic acid is produced. And that's what's helping us, or part of what's helping us produce a gel from liquid milk, a solid from a liquid. So the two bacteria that do this in yogurt are Streptococcus thermophilus and Lactobacillus bulgarius, which is from the lactic acid bacteria family. This is a whole group of organisms that ferment food products and that are found all over the environment. So these types of products ferment cabbage into sauerkraut, all kinds of milk products into different milk products, such as kefir and yogurt and sour cream and cheese, of course. Lactic acid bacteria are used to ferment sausages, to make summer sausages, all kinds of things. So why do we need two? Why are there two different types of bacteria? Well, as you might guess from lactic acid bacteria from the name, these bacteria really prefer to grow in a more acidic environment. Now, there is a range. There can be too much acid present, and that prevents growth. But they really do prefer to be in a somewhat acidic environment. The Streptococcus thermophilus, on the other hand, prefers to grow at a neutral pH, around 7, which is where milk starts. So Streptococcus thermophilus is the first organism that grows, and that organism does produce acid as a byproduct of fermentation. And as the pH of the milk drops, then the Lactobacillus bulgarius takes over and begins to grow and produces more lactic acid than the Streptococcus could do on its own. So this is a dual fermentation done by two different types of bacteria. And then the solidification of this gel is done by the change in pH, right? So the activation step in this case is really that that lactose being converted to lactic acid and lactic acid dropping the pH. So this is typical milk. Fat globule, liquid casein micelles, an up-close view of the casein micelle itself, and an interior view where you can see these calcium phosphate particles holding the different casein proteins together and the kappa casein tail sticking out. So as the lactic acid is produced from fermentation, those kappa casein tails loosen, the casein proteins start to loosen up in their micelle and disperse, but as acid continues to increase and the lactobacillus take over, those casein proteins clump back together even more tightly clustered. And eventually, they interact with each other. And this gives you that three-dimensional network, turning a liquid into a very weak solid yogurt. That we find on the shelf, there is added protein there by added milk powder. This helps take care of having any water that syneresis on the top. And syneresis just means water that is being exuded from the gel that's formed. So sometimes there's syneresis on the top, and that's generally seen by consumers as a negative quality attribute, so they want to try to prevent it. So these things can be adjusted in yogurt. As to cheese, we have a whole process that we're doing. This process can contain numerous modifications. What we do after that cheese is formed and how we age it, again, adjust the taste, the flavor, the texture, all of these things afterwards. So there's a tremendous amount of variation that can happen with cheese production. But we are going to talk about just a general scope of how this works. There's a great video that is linked on Moodle that you can take a look at. And that link will give you a good visual as to what each of these steps is containing. So we're going to start up here in the left corner with milk. Milk definitely is a liquid, so we're starting there. And then we pasteurize that milk. Now, some cheeses are made with raw milk. That's allowable. The cheese in the United States cannot be sold until it's at least 6 months old. And this is to prevent foodborne illness from happening. So the cheese if made with raw milk, has to be at least 6 months old. But typically, milk is pasteurized prior to making cheese. And this is to eliminate any competitive growth of microorganisms. We want the microorganisms that we add to the milk to ferment the milk to have all of that lactose for themselves. So we pasteurize the milk. That gets rid of all of our pathogens that could cause illness, but it also decreases the microbial load in that milk and prevents competitive growth. Once we've got pasteurized milk, we're going to go ahead and add a starter bacteria, and that's oftentimes called a starter culture. That varies, what exactly bacteria is added varies across different types of cheeses. Rennet is also added to cheeses, and this is what an extract from the calf's stomach was called, rennet or renin. And this extract particularly has one ingredient that we're interested in adding to the milk, and that is the enzyme chymosin. So the enzyme chymosin is going to enzymatically alter the casein micelle and help gelation happen and form even firmer curds. We'll talk more about what exactly is going on there. And then sometimes calcium chloride can be added. As you know, there's plenty of calcium in milk, and calcium is a divalent ion having two positive charges. So if you remember back to pectin and how we talked about low methoxypectin, gelation being caused for low methoxypectin by this calcium bridging phenomena where two negative compounds are bridged because of the two positive calcium ions that are there, or the one ion, but having two positive charges, excuse me. So this calcium bridging can also take place in cheese products, and very often this will create a very firm curd. Okay, so we can have all three of these ingredients. Very typically what we're adding primarily is starter bacteria or starter culture, and then rennet, the enzyme chymosin. So this gives us our cheese milk. It's still a liquid product. Eventually, enough acid is produced by the fermentation, by the growth of these bacteria, the consumption of lactose, and the production of lactic acid to cause a gel. The pH is low enough that this coagulum can gel. Rennet does its enzymatic action and eliminates negative charge around the micelle, allowing the micelles to come together in a three-dimensional network, right? So now we have this soft solid. It still has all the moisture that the milk had, right? We've gotten rid of none of the moisture at this point. We've just caused a gel to form. So this is what we call curds. Once we've got that gelled soft milk, the curds are then cut, and creating more surface area by cutting these curds into large or small cubes allows for the whey that is contained within this gel to flow out. All right, so there's casein and whey in milk. Those are two groups of proteins. The casein is what forms the curd, and the whey is a byproduct of the process. So the whey is removed. This is a clear yellow liquid, is drained off once the product is cut. And the goal here, depending on how much whey you remove, really controls how firm this curd is going to be initially. So we can cut that curd, the whey is drained off, and then a process called cheddaring begins if you're making cheddar cheese. If you're making cheddar cheese, oftentimes the curds are sort of formed into blocks and then stacked on the side of the tank, and the pressure of the weight of the curds that are stacked helps compress those curds and push out more of the whey, removing more of the water. Milling is simply putting it into some type of form or shape, and molding it, or milling it is chopping it up, and then molding it is putting it into the form or shape. That product is then ripened, and you have your end goal, which is cheese, right? A very firm solid that has had quite a bit of the moisture from this milk removed. So let's talk a little bit about the casein micelle, because really causing this casein micelle to interact with its neighbors is our goal. We want that to happen, but we need to do a couple of things first. So here is a cartoon of our casein micelle. The casein proteins, just like when we talked about egg white proteins, casein proteins are made up with lots of different specific proteins that are there. And these proteins form these little submicelles that are held together with calcium phosphate. So these are all ionically held together. Remember, we have our three different types of bonds, a group of non-covalent bonds, which are electrostatic, which includes ionic bonding, hydrogen bonding, and hydrophobic bonding, and then our covalent bonds, which are sulfhydryls, disulfide bonds that are present. Right, so this casein micelle is held together through electrostatic interactions that are facilitated by these calcium phosphate clusters that we see here within the micelle. Now, all these squiggly little hairs on the outside are proteins, and it just so happens that all of these squiggly little hairs have negative charge. This protein, this peptide chain that's connected to the micelles, is called kappa casein. Kappa casein is negatively charged, and so in milk, these casein micelles are very unlikely to come together because they have this halo of negative charge, right? So you might remember when we talked about flocculation in colloidal systems. We wanted to make sure our oil droplets or our air bubbles didn't flocculate together, and one way to do that is to put similar charge all around every droplet or bubble. So if we do that, that similar charge repels, and it means that these droplets don't come together. And this is exactly what happens in milk with casein micelles. Casein micelle is overall negatively charged, and so each micelle having a negative charge, each one repels the other. They don't come together, which is great in liquid milk. But when we want to make a gel, we have to make this change, right? So how do we do that? The first thing we do is related to pH. So if you have something that's electrostatically stabilized, like a casein micelle, changing the charge is a great way to destabilize it. And in this case, that's exactly what we're trying to do. So we add the starter bacteria, fermentation occurs, lactic acid is produced, and this lowers the pH. Milk starts out around 7, and eventually what we want to do is lower it down to 4.7. And this is about the isoelectric point of these proteins. And so that means we'll just have overall neutral charge, the perfect place for them to interact with each other using other types of bonds like hydrogen and hydrophobic bonds. So once we lower this pH, this dissolves that calcium phosphate that's in crystal form inside that micelle, and it loosens the structure of the micelle. This inherently destabilizes it because we're removing some of that electrostatic stabilization. So fermentation is the first part of it. The second part of this is to remove that steric stabilization of the actual protein projecting into the solution and the negative charge. So we've got all of our kappa casein peptides that are on the exterior of this micelle, and those are negatively charged. So what we want to do is chop those off, and that's exactly what chymosin does, our enzyme that is in rennet. So the purpose of adding this enzyme is to clip off all of these negatively charged, or the majority of these negatively charged kappa casein peptides. Once we do that, then these micelles can come together more easily, right? So the rennet clips off the kappa casein, and once this kappa casein is removed from the micelle, the overall casein micelle, we see that this particular peptide change is now called glycomacropeptide. And very typically it is lost with the whey protein stream, right? The whey stream that's being removed from the cheese. So now we have electrostatic stabilization removed because we lowered the pH. We have this, and we got rid of negative charge. We also have removed the steric stabilization, meaning that these proteins just don't allow the casein micelles to come close enough to form a gel, as well as the negative repulsion and charge. But we've removed that by adding our chymosin enzyme and clipping these off. So once we add that rennet, those kappa casein protein peptides are removed, and now we can get this three-dimensional chain of casein micelles that forms the gel that is cheese. So this is what's formed in our cheese milk and our coagulate. We have this extensive network here. And what's trapped in all these little holes is fat and water, right? So once we clip or we start cutting this curd, then that water can be expressed more easily. The fat tends to actually bind to some of these proteins because of hydrophobic interactions. So the fat hangs around a little bit in the cheese and is not drained off with the whey protein water stream that is removed. So that's the general process of how we use fermentation to take milk to a solid, and then to even concentrate that protein, carbohydrate, and fat there, all those nutritional compounds that we're interested in saving, concentrate them even further and form a solid, hard cheese, or more firm solid, I guess would be a better word, because there is quite a degree of difference between, say, something like a cream cheese than something like an aged Parmesan. The texture is very different. Now, this is a chart or a flow diagram from your book on food and cooking, and it really is the most logical sequence steps to talk about the different families of cheeses and the different styles of making cheeses. You do not need to memorize this entirely. What you need to know is what these different steps do and how it's changing the cheese, right? So we start out with our milk, pasteurize and cool, and acidify and coagulate that. So how we do that can vary. We talked about adding starter enzyme or starter bacteria and enzymes. We can also directly add acid to the mix. If you are a fan of Brugger's cream cheese, that's exactly how they make their cream cheese. It's not a fermented product. They add direct acid directly to the milk, and that is how the pH is decreased. And that's called direct acidification. So this can happen with cream cheeses very often. And in this case, these two types of fresh cheeses, paneer and queso fresco. Paneer is an Indian cheese, or cheese is often used in Indian food and cuisine. Queso fresco, of course, is a Mexican or Hispanic cheese that's often used. You may be familiar with queso dip. So these two types of cheeses are directly acidified. They also utilize heat in this process to further firm the curds and encourage interactions between casein micelles. And that's how you get these two very, very elastic cheeses. Both of these cheeses have in common that they're extremely elastic in texture, meaning that they rebound when deformed, right? So we can press on them and they'll bounce right back, just like a rubber band would if you stretched it. So that's one type of cheese. Once we've got the starter bacteria added, the fermentation takes place, and our pH is lowered due to fermentation, we can have all of these fresh cheeses that are made. Now notice when you think about these cheeses, fresh goat's milk cheese, fromage blanc, cottage cheese, cream cheese, these are all very high moisture cheeses. So very, not as much of the whey has been removed here. This also makes them more perishable, so they will go bad more quickly without adding in some additional preservatives. If we move down the line, we've got our curd that is formed here and then cut. So at this point, you can go two different directions. What we would make in lab would be ricotta, and at this point, the whey can be removed, and that whey stream can be used to make ricotta. Right? And this is just done with heat. What we would have done in class is making ricotta using whole milk. So our ricotta would not only have whey proteins in it, but also casein micelles in it as well. But this was very often what was done with a whey stream. Now, this whey stream was considered waste for a very long time. And so people that lived on a farm who did not want to waste good nutrition would gather up all of this whey from the cheese, boil it again, and coagulate that whey protein through heating and form ricotta. And ricotta in Italian actually means twice cooked. So this is how it was described. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it would be to feed it to your livestock. And this was often done with the whey protein stream industrially. In many countries, once industrial cheese production became very popular, at some point we realized that, this whey stream has some protein in it. It didn't have nearly as much protein concentration as the casein portion of milk, but there was definitely enough protein there that we needed to consider making a value-added product out of it. So people began to purify or concentrate the whey protein stream. And now that whey stream that comes from cheese manufacturer is actually making more money than the cheese production. So it's just a way that we can see that it's beneficial to not waste valuable nutrition. So that's one slant off the line that we can go to. The second thing that we can do here with this curd is we could add penicillin molds, and this is where you get mold ripened cheeses. And so once we add these molds, which are very often penicillin molds, to these different cheeses, it gives you entirely new flavor and dimension. It changes the texture of the cheese. So a very typical blue cheese like Gorgonzola or Roquefort or Stilton is going to have a very distinct flavor. And that's because of the enzymes that are produced by the mold as they grow. These enzymes, in all these cases, whether it's bacteria or mold, enzymes are produced from the growth of these organisms, and they break down the proteins and the lipids and carbohydrates that are there. Those breakdown products are actually creating vastly different flavor profiles in every one of these cheeses. So the Gorgonzola or blue family has a flavor compound called methyl ketone. It is that distinctive blue cheese flavor that a lot of people don't care for. So you can also have cheeses that are mold ripened on the exterior. The exterior of that particular cheese is washed with mold. This is one of the ones that's in your table of cheese production and concentration and pH. Limburger is a very stinky cheese. So these mold ripened cheeses are often very distinctive in flavor and can be quite unusual and offensive in their flavor profile and aroma. Limburger is one of those cheeses that if you bring it into a room, everyone will know. And then these Camembert goat's milk cheeses up here, these are also the cheese is molded and formed, and the exterior of that cheese is washed with a mold organism. And then that mold, as it grows, the enzymes that it produces migrate into the block of cheese, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. So that's one family of cheeses, one thing that you can do. Once we have the curd is cut and the whey is released, now we have curd particles, and we can start getting into some more harder type of cheeses. The feta type cheeses here, which are brined after the curds are cut and the whey is expressed. So these curds are formed, they are cut into little cubes, and then those cubes are then pickled in a saltwater solution. We can even go down here and form one of our favorite cheeses here in America, used on pizza, mozzarella or pizza cheese, provolone. Now these cheeses all undergo something called stretching, and this is done to align the protein network so that it is all in these forms. If you've ever eaten string cheese, you'll know that you peel the cheese back and it's very stringy, hence the name string cheese. That is also a stretched cheese product that aligns all of the different protein fibers. Once you have curd particles, you can do yet another type of procedure, which is washing the curd in warm water. So oftentimes we'll do add additional heat processes here. So we've got 3 different things now that can affect the texture of our curd in the formation of our gel. We've got the fermentation that starts off with our bacteria, which decreases the pH, and that causes gelation. We've added rennet, so that eliminates some of the steric stabilization and electrostatic stabilization of the casein micelles, allowing them to interact more tightly. And then the third thing that can happen is that we heat these proteins. And you know that heating proteins causes denaturation. Once we have denaturation or unfolding, it is much more likely that these proteins are going to interact to form some kind of gel. And this is something that is happening here in this Dutch style cheese, Edam, Gouda, Colby, and Jack. So the curds are taken and they're washed once again. This helps to remove some of that calcium, some of the acid that's there. This basically changes the texture of the cheese as it ages. So calcium is going to help change that cheese to be less elastic. And then the acid is going to change the overall profile and not be as sour if we're removing some of that acid. And you get a very firm cheese. All of these cheeses end up being quite firm if aged. So we can, instead of going this route where we're making our Dutch style cheeses, stretched mozzarella and feta, where we still have fairly high moisture contents, we can take those curd particles and heat them yet again. So we can take them up to anywhere between 100 degrees Fahrenheit and 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And what this does is it causes the casein network that is formed in the gel to contract and press out more of that whey. So we're concentrating the protein and lipids that are there even more. Once we do that, you get into this family of much firmer cheeses that age very well. So some of cheeses like Manchego, which is a sheep's milk cheese, these are just gently pressed, so they have a little bit more water that remains. The cheddaring style that we talked about, where the curds are piled onto each other, and this allows them to press out more of the moisture. They're then cut up again and pressed into molds. That's cheddar cheese as we know it. Once these curds are heated again, then they're taken and just pressed very firmly together, and that expresses even more moisture. And this gets into the type of cheese like Swiss cheese, Fontino, these type of cheeses that we think of as being very elastic and firm. And again, we can press it very firmly and get into our Parmesan, Pecorino Romano type cheeses that all age very well. All of these cheeses can be aged with varying levels of success. Generally speaking, the less moisture these cheeses have, the better the aging process will go. So the further you move down this central line, the better the aging process will be. You don't typically see aged cream cheeses because they're just too high in moisture, and you'll get some negative flavors because of the growth of bacteria that's still occurring here. All right. So this is a lot of information, but just be familiar with what's happening. If the curd is heated, what's going to happen? What type of texture are you going to get at the end of the day? If we just press out the whey, what are we going to get if we add salt, right? What are we going to get if we stretch the curd? So be familiar with those general directions. You don't have to memorize all of these different cheeses that are listed. So this is a particular cheese which we would have tasted if we'd been all together. And it is produced by a creamery in California called Cypress Grove. They make lots of very interesting cheeses that are quite delicious. All of them, I believe, are goat's milk cheeses. And so this is a goat's milk cheese. This particular cheese is called Humboldt Fog. It is a mold exterior ripened cheese. So the process of making this cheese is that they take the first morning's milking, they remove the cream from it, and they use that cream for the bottom layer of this cheese. So they make cheese with the cream, and that's the bottom layer. They then put this line of vegetable ash here, right? So this is just a basic line of vegetable ash. And then the afternoon's milking, the cream is removed and added to the top here once cheese is formed from it. Once they press this into a mold, they roll the entire thing in vegetable ash and then put a washing of mold on the exterior. So this white layer on the exterior is actually the mold that is applied for aging. Now you can see here that the cheese, this is at production, so the cheese is very firm, right? There's no dipping. It's a nice solid block or round of cheese. And it looks pretty homogeneous throughout the block, regardless of this vegetable ash line. Once we've aged it a little bit, you start to see this layer form right up next to the mold washed exterior. This is where the mold is growing and the enzymes from that growth are penetrating into the cheese. So why does it change in appearance? The appearance is changing because the lipid that is in the cheese is breaking down. Lots of enzymes are going in, and by breaking down those lipid enzymes are called lipases. The lipase enters the cheese and starts to break down the fat that's there. And this changes that appearance to be more translucent. Proteins are also being broken down. So proteases are being formed by these molds as they grow, and they enter the cheese and they begin to break down that casein network. And so we start to see here, if you can look at the overall block, we start to see a little bit of a dip right here, we can see that it's not as firm, and the weight of the cheese itself is actually causing it to collapse. If we go to a very aged Humboldt fog cheese, and this is not typically how you find it, it's typically sold at about this age. But a very aged Humboldt fog cheese, you can see this core of the original texture still remains, but the outside that's next to this mold rind is practically liquefied. It definitely oozes like a liquid would. That protein network, the casing network that is there, has been broken down to such an extent that it has changed the overall texture. This also changes flavor. All of these lipids that are being broken down are being broken down into fatty acids. And fatty acids in and of themselves, the smaller that they are, the shorter the chain fatty acid is, the more volatile flavor it's going to have. It's smaller molecular weight, so it's more volatile. And these can often be very distinct, funky flavors. Butyric acid is one that is a short chain fatty acid that is often formed in these breakdown processes. We are very sensitive to it as people. At different concentrations, it will have different types of aromas. Butyric acid is what we're classically familiar with in baby vomit. So baby vomit has a very distinct smell, and this is because the enzymes in the stomach have already started to break down that lipid that's there and gives it that butyric acid kind of aroma. That they're not all negative, and they can have some positive attributes as well and appeal to people around the world. So both the protein breakdown and the lipid breakdown create not only textural variation, but definitely flavor variation. The last thing I'll say is this is the link to the video about commercial cheese production. I encourage you to watch it. It gives you a visual to that diagram, flow diagram of taking milk to cheese milk to curd, coagulate, and then cutting into curd and forming blocks of cheese. It does a much better job of describing those things with pictures than just words. So I encourage you to watch that video. It is linked on Moodle. There are several other videos that are linked there for lab, one related to making ricotta at home, and one also related to making yogurt. So watch those two videos to give you an idea, a visual of what we would be doing in lab. Until I see you again, I wish you well.
Cheese is made from milk. Sometimes that milk comes from cows, but in some parts of the world it comes from sheep, goats, or other breeds. But it's primarily starting from milk. Most times they will add starter culture to it, which are bacteria to it. When they get added to the milk fat and the temperature is warm and there's lots of sugar around for them to ferment on, they will start to grow and ferment this lactose in there. They will start to increase in numbers. They will double, divide, and grow, produce more acid. And that's what we want in this cheese making process. We want them to grow and produce some acid to drop the pH down. But their primary reason to be there is that they can ferment lactose. Now there are other cultures out there that don't ferment lactose, and they're not that valuable in this process to ferment because they wouldn't use the sugar, because that's the only primary sugar in milk is lactose. The other thing that's added often too for some varieties is some color, to give it a stronger red color or yellow color to it. And the other thing that's the last ingredient that's usually added is what is called a rennet enzyme, which is historically extracted from calves, and that is the enzyme that actually clots milk and helps to create the cheese. But they are the only ingredients that we use for it. The main steps in cheese making are, nowadays we pasteurize the milk, but historically they would not have pasteurized the milk. Next step, they would add a starter culture to it, which will be the thing that will ferment the lactose, the sugar, milk sugar, to lactic acid. After that, they will add the rennet enzyme, which will be the enzyme that clots the milk protein and allows it to form this gel. Once this gel has formed, and it usually doesn't take more than 10 to 30 minutes for it to gel, the cheesemaker will cut it into cubes with a knife or a harp or some blade. Once that sample has been cut, they will stir it, and once they think they have enough acid developed in this milk by the starter culture, They will remove the whey or drain it through a sieve or a screen or some belt or something. And all actions from there on are trying to get some more whey or water out of these curd particles to make it a lower moisture product so it'll have a longer shelf life rather than go spoil very quickly within hours or days, which it would have historically done. Then, depending on the variety, they will either chop it up into pieces and add dry salt to it, or in some varieties like Swiss and other cheeses, they will take the cheese and put it into a tank of salt. We call it brine solution, and it will sit in that brine solution for either hours or days, depending on the variety. Once that process is done, the cheese now is stored in some room, cave, or some environment where it will stay for days, weeks, months, years, depending on the variety. Sometimes we will package it with some plastic wrap or vacuum pack to remove oxygen. Sometimes they will put a wax on the outside, otherwise it will dry out. So here in this lab we have several different approaches for testing cheese. One is compositionally testing what's in there, whether it's just how much fat, how much protein, how much salt, things like that are present in it. But there's also analytical for what type of flavor compounds are present. Are they the right type of flavor compound for the cheese? Is the concentration too low, too high for this nice flavor we expect in this particular variety? So that's another type of testing we do. And another testing we do is how well it performs or the texture is looking like, for example, for melt or stretch or some performance like that, because a lot of cheese is used in pizzas, hamburgers, in lasagnas, in all sorts of dishes. What we do is we actually use rheology equipment, which is very similar to what they use in chemical engineering departments. We actually study what the mechanical properties are of these cheeses when they're heated. We use these kind of tests for all different types of cheeses.